Good morning, everybody. It is Election Day 2025, and I'm here to talk about the elections in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If you haven't done so already, please go out and vote. I voted on Sunday, voted early. It was nice and easy. And if you haven't already done some early voting, go ahead and vote on Election Day. Your voice matters, and we are extremely privileged to live in a democracy where we're able to vote. So please exercise that right. Um, and do that. Even if you don't live in Virginia or New Jersey, there may be elections happening in your state, so go double check to make sure you aren't missing out. Let's get into it. It's election day. I'm going to do the Virginia predictions final. We've got a very close race for Attorney General. We've got interesting races for governor and lieutenant governor, and I'm going to actually go in that order, or in that reverse order. We're going to start with governor, then we're going to do lieutenant governor, which is going to be pretty downstream of governor, and then we're going to save the best for last, that race for attorney general between Jay Jones and Jason Mirayes. We're going to talk about it at the end of the video. So we'll start with the race for governor. At the top of the ticket, Abigail Spanberger, the former congresswoman, the Democrat running against winsome Earle-Sears, former lieutenant governor, the Republican, and the trends have been pretty baked in for the past couple of weeks. Just to be pretty blunt here, it does not look like winsome Earle-Sears has closed the gap in any meaningful way. Her best poll from the past couple of weeks has been this Trafalgar poll, which had her down by 4. She was down 46-42, but Trafalgar did another poll, and they found the race had shifted a little bit against her on November 2nd. They had her down by 7, so not much in the way of super close polling that would indicate anything interesting happening here. Nonpartisan polling, insider advantage. This is a nonpartisan poll for this specific survey. Spanberger's up by 10 here. She's up by 8 in Research Co. Echelon has her up by 12. Emerson and Atlas Intel, these are two of the more famous pollsters. She's up by 11 in Emerson. She's up by 9 in Atlas Intel. And then we had some pretty decisive leads for her in YouGov and State Navigate. YouGov in particular, this is surprising. This is a pretty big, not maybe an outlier, but it's definitely the strongest poll she's gotten in a while. She's up 57-42. So the polls show a high single-digit, low double-digit advantage for Spanberger over Earle-Sears, and most polls show her well above 50%. The only poll that doesn't is the 46-42 Trafalgar poll, but even then, their second poll had her up at 50%, over 43% for winsome Earle-Sears. So, in terms of the polling, the picture is pretty clear. It is quite, the advantage is pretty baked in for Spanberger, and that's, I think, that's not too surprising. A common trend that I like to talk about for races for governor of Virginia is that since 2001, the party in power has only won one election for governor. So if we go back 2001, Democrats won that race. They won it again in 2005. I think 2001 was Mark Warner was elected governor. 2005 it was Tim Kaine. Both years, not only had Bush won the election, but Virginia had actually voted for Bush. Then they elected Democratic governors. 2009, Virginia votes for Obama. Or 2008, Virginia votes for Obama. 2009, they elect Bob McDonnell, a Republican. There's their governor by nearly 18%. 2013 is the one exception. It voted for Obama won the election. He won Virginia too, and then Democrats narrowly held the race for governor there in 2013, the next year with Terry McAuliffe. But again, McAuliffe benefited from a libertarian candidate taking away a pretty substantial chunk of the vote. And had the Libertarian not been in the race, the consensus is that the Republican Ken Cuccinelli might have won, or excuse me, not Ken Cuccinelli, but the Republican might have won that race. It was Ken Cuccinelli. And then 2017, Trump won the election. He didn't win Virginia, but he won the election, and Democrats won the governorship. Then in 2021, despite the fact that Biden won the election, he won Virginia by 10 points. Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, he comes in and he flips this, governor's mansion back red in a result that was initially pretty surprising. I mean, this was the race that was considered to be likely Democratic even just a few months before the election was held. And Youngkin ran a really strong campaign, was able to make the race a toss-up by Election Day, and he ended up pulling it out with a 2-point win over Terry McAuliffe, the former governor. So Virginia tends to swing back and forth, and this advantage that Spanberger is seeing in the polls, say what you want about it, but it's not exactly unexpected. And that's the first thing you have to remember, which is that national dynamics favor Democrats, both here and in New Jersey, but national dynamics, right? The party out of power, they have a bit of a turnout advantage. They have a bit of a persuasion advantage because often, swing voters are a little upset at the party in power. The party in power is a bit less motivated, right? That can create pretty favorable environments for the party out of power, which is why, right, like in 2017, Democrats won both New Jersey and Virginia pretty decisively. And then in 2021, Republicans did a lot better in both those states compared to 2017. So just something to keep in mind as we progress throughout the video, which is that Democrats do have a bit of a national advantage in this sense, and that's reflected in the polling data, which obviously in this year, 2025, the polls are not super close. In 2021, most polls showed a close race or a race that Youngkin was nearly winning. And so then another thing I want to talk about, is now that we've established that the national environment probably favors Democrats a little bit, Virginia especially has a local environment that is pretty pro-democratic at the moment. And if you go and watch my New Jersey video, which I released a couple hours ago this morning, I talk a lot about how Democrats are at a bit of a disadvantage locally there because they've been in governance for 8 years and because Phil Murphy is not the most popular governor, right? There is, I think, some anger at Democrats locally in that state that could have a bit of an effect on Mikey Sherrill's chances tonight. We'll see. Virginia, that's not the case. This is a Republican administration with Glenn Youngkin that's outgoing, and the other thing we have to consider is that a lot of the budget cuts that have been made by the Trump administration have a uniquely pronounced effect on Virginia, especially Chesapeake Bay and Nova, which have a lot of government employees, a lot of federal government impact in those regions that are pretty swingy, and will have a lot of votes to be cast, right? And the Trump administration's position with regard to these federal agencies that are often having layoffs and funding cuts, might not necessarily be as advantageous to Republicans. There might be some anger from people who are tied to this, who are tied to the cuts and the layoffs a little bit. So that's something to consider. I don't think it's going to swing the race one way or another, but I think it could be worth a little bit of momentum and maybe a couple thousand votes across the state. And that would probably benefit Abigail Spanberger a lot more so than win some Earle-Sears. So that's, I think, where this race stands. One thing I do want to kind of comment on a little bit is that in 2021, Glenn Youngkin did really well in Loudoun County. I mean, he only lost it by 11%. And if we look at 2024 with Kamala Harris, even though she didn't do all that well in Loudoun, she still won it by 17. So in 2021, what we saw was clear. Glenn Youngkin did really well with these, moderate Biden voters in the suburbs who were a little upset at Democrats for one reason or another, and, were, open to the campaign that Glenn Youngkin had run. And so what that resulted in was a substantial shift. And again, Loudoun County was Biden plus 25. It was only McAuliffe plus 11. So we saw substantial, swings, and the same as in Prince William County, which Harris won by 18, McAuliffe won by 17. So look for Loudoun and Prince William. These are affluent, highly educated suburbs of Washington, D.C. Democrats have done well here for the past decade and a half. And in 2021, Republicans made some inroads. I would say that on a even decent night for Abigail Spanberger and the Democratic Party, there should be a pretty significant swing left in Loudoun, in Prince William, compared to 2021. And honestly, compared to 2024 too, even though Kamala Harris did a bit better here than Terry McAuliffe did. One other thing I want to highlight is, Richmond, right? Actually, we'll do two more. Richmond has been hugely left trending in the past couple of years. I mean, Henrico County voted for McAuliffe by 18.5, voted for Kamala Harris by nearly 30. So, in that 3-year stretch, we saw this county get over 10% bluer. I would expect a pretty decisive margin for Abigail Spanberger out of these areas. And then Chesterfield County, which voted for Harris by 9, didn't even vote for Terry McAuliffe in 2021. So, there should be a lot of blue in Richmond. And then lastly, I mentioned this earlier, but the Chesapeake Bay, region, these are counties that are pretty swingy, right? We see Glenn Youngkin took these by, mid-single digits in 2021. These are both Kamala Harris counties. Youngkin did especially well in these areas, right? Relative to Trump in 2024, he did better in Virginia Beach than he even did in Loudoun because Trump did quite well in Loudoun last year too, right? So what we really should be seeing is some level of a shift more in the Harris direction. Because again, these are Kamala Harris counties, and even though Glenn Youngkin did quite well here in 2021, Democrats have been improving in these areas, especially due to population growth. And realistically, I'd expect Spanberger to do quite well in Chesapeake Bay, just as a result of those Democratic trends. So Richmond, Chesapeake Bay, I think should be pretty blue tonight. We'll see Loudon. We'll see Prince William. I think these are trickier for Democrats. But at this point, I think a good sign for Spanberger would be, at least an 8 to 10 point shift away from what we saw in 2021 in her direction. Now, for Winsome Earle-Sears, I think what she should be watching is turnout a lot, to a pretty substantial degree, just because, like in cities like Richmond and in these, kind of towns along Chesapeake Bay, and then of course Charlottesville and these cities in Fairfax County, Democrats are going to win all these areas pretty decisively, right? Like talk about Norfolk or Portsmouth or Charlottesville or Arlington or whatever you want to go. These are Democratic cities. For this race to be even close, turnout there is going to have to be pretty weak. And on the contrary, I think Republican turnout is going to have to be pretty strong in the Appalachian part of the state. In 2021, one of the concerns for Youngkin was whether or not he could raise turnout in this part of the state. It was very good. He outran Trump in every county, including these Appalachian counties over here. So, just as something to consider for Winsome Earle-Sears. I do not think, in case you can't tell, I do not think she's going to win or come close to winning, but I do think that if we're to see a closer than expected race tonight, for Winsome Earle-Sears, the key's going to be turnout more so than persuasion, just because I don't think she's run the campaign that's going to put her in a great position for persuasion. So, with that being said, my call in this race for governor, I'm going to go Spanberger by 10. I know initially some people were saying it was going to be high single digits. I think it's going to be 10, probably. And if I had to bet, it's probably going to be a little more than 10. It's going to be like a 10-3 or 10-4 instead of like a 9.7 or a 9.8 margin of victory for Spanberger. So I do think she'll do a little bit better than Biden in 2020. That's for a couple of reasons, right? I've already laid out most of them. The polling data is pretty clear. I think the electorate's going to be pretty favorable to Spanberger, just because we're going to get a very, very I just think that based on what we're seeing in the in terms of I guess you could say early voting, but also just in terms of like polling data, Democrats in Virginia seem to be a bit more enthused. Republicans at the top of the ticket. I don't think Winsome Earle-Sears has run that great of a campaign. 2021 it was the opposite, where Democrats were kind of running a pretty lackluster campaign with McCall. They had a couple bloopers and gaffes there, and then we also saw Republicans really rallied behind Youngkin, especially on the education issue. Not really the case this year. I do not think Spanberger's run a Youngkin tier campaign, but she doesn't need to. It's a blue state. Kamala Harris won it by 6. This should be a Spanberger plus 10 type of night. And I think if it's close to like a 7-point win for Spanberger, that's a bad sign for Democrats. This should be a 10-point win, and honestly, it could be more if the environment's better for Democrats than I'm expecting, because I still think nationally Democrats are in a little bit of trouble, even if it's better than 2024. So with that, I'm going to make my call for the race for lieutenant governor. I think this is going to be like a span or a Ghazala Hashmi plus 9 type of result. This is to me a race that is going to be very, very similar to the race for governor. We do see in some polls that, this is Attorney General polls. We don't have any, I'm not going to focus too much on lieutenant governor polls because they're very similar to governor polls. But for the most part, we see John Reed, the Republican, is for nominee for lieutenant governor, is outrunning Winsome Earle-Sears by 1 to 2 points. I think that delta is pretty consistent across most surveys. I would expect Reed to do a little bit better in Nova than Winsome Earle-Sears, just because this is kind of Spanberger's home turf. It is not Ghazala Hashmi's home turf. She's from Richmond. But overall, this is to me not a race that's super competitive. Republicans haven't really, and this applies to the race for governor too, but Republicans have not put in a ton of energy to saving their hold on the position of lieutenant governor. And Democrats in Ghazala Hashmi seem to have a pretty strong candidate overall. So I would definitely say that this is going to be a very interesting race to watch in terms of the delta, but I probably shouldn't be more than 1 to 2 points between Spanberger and Ghazala Hashmi. I would think Hashmi wins by 9.5. Spanberger wins by 10.4. Call it 9.4 for Ghazala Hashmi. I don't have a ton to say about this race. Again, it's just going to track with the race for governor, and the only real way in which I could see John Reed winning this race for the Republicans would be if something goes horribly wrong for Democrats in terms of turnout, and if Spanberger is within 2 or 3 points of losing. So make of that what you will. But I'm pretty confident, like I'm in Spanberger, in Ghazala Hashmi winning. So with that, the main event for tonight's election is going to be the race for Attorney General between Jay Jones and Jason Mirayes. Now, this is going to be a doozy. And if we look at 2021, what we can see is that, this race was the closest on the ticket. And that's not necessarily because Jason Mirayes ran a bad campaign or because he was worse than Winsome, Earle-Sears or Glenn Youngkin, but because he's running against an incumbent Democrat in Mark Herring, who had won in 2017. He had a couple scandals, right? Wasn't necessarily a strong candidate, but he was an incumbent, and he nearly won re-election just off of that. So what I would say the first thing to consider is that we're now kind of in the reverse position where Republicans, they do not have an incumbent in the race for governor. Obviously, they also don't have an incumbent in the race for lieutenant governor because Winsome Earle-Sears is moving out to run for governor. And so their only incumbent left is Jason Mirayes. And that, I think, alone gives him a pretty substantial advantage just because he's an incumbent. And then the other thing is that even though the race for governor is at the top of the ticket, and it's one tilting the direction of Democrats, I think, pretty decisively, the race for AG could be a little bit different. And I'm not even talking about the J. Jones scandal yet. I'm talking about the fact that when we think about ticket splitting, it generally happens more and more down the ticket, which is why, like in states like North Carolina, you'll see the GOP will win races for presidency by 2 to 3%. They might win the race for agriculture commissioner by 5 to 8%, but then they'll lose the race for Secretary of State or for Attorney General by 3 points, right? So we see pretty interesting deltas just the further down the ballot you go, and in a race like Attorney General, which is maybe not as top of mind for voters as the race for governor or for other races like senator, you're going to get pretty interesting results. So that's the first thing you want to say, and that works to the Republican Party's favor because they have an incumbent as well. Now, this race should still not be close. This should be, a 5 to 6 point margin of victory for Democrats, probably, and that's being conservative with any other candidate. But the problem is that Democrats are running Jay Jones, who initially didn't seem to be a super, controversial candidate, but on October 1st, we had a bit of an October surprise, likely due to some pretty effective opposition research by Team Mirayes, which revealed that Jay Jones sent some text messages joking about political violence and the assassination of his opponents on the other side of the aisle. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about these text messages because there's policies I have to follow on YouTube, but they're it's joking about political violence in a pretty undeniable way, in a way that's pretty I would say unacceptable to the vast majority of voters, Democrat and Republican alike. And so that scandal has really thrown this race into chaos, and Mirayes has led in more polls than not in the past few weeks. Now, these polls are all very close. The only poll that we really saw that had a decisive was Roanoke, which had Mirayes up by 8, but there were a lot of undecided voters, and that poll was a little bit, I'd say, odd. It was an outlier in most races. And secondly, most polls that show Mirayes winning do not have him at 50%. As you can see, he actually is at 50% in 0 polls. Jay Jones is also 50% in 0 polls, except for the One State Navigate poll we got. But he's actually, he's in a couple. That's not fair. I forgot Emerson. He's at 51 in Emerson. So he's at 50 in a couple. But nonetheless, I think the polls show a race that is undeniably close at this point. So I think we now have to talk about the delta here, because I think Spanberger wins by 10, a little more than that. I think Hosh wins by 9, a little more than that. And at this point, we have to consider how much is Jason Mirayes going to outrun Winsome Earle-Sears by, because we're going to use the governor's race as our baseline because it's at the top of the ticket. I think it's going to be at or above 10%. So if you're keeping track at home, if Spanberger's up by, say 10.3 or 10.4, that would mean that Jay Jones and Jason Mirayes are in a functionally 50-50 race. I'm going to say who I think is going to win at the end of this section, but I think we have to consider that those structural fundamentals in this race make it such that Jay Jones is probably in a pure toss-up race with Jason Mirayes. Now, we have to do after that is consider where the ticket splitting is going to come from. Obviously, I would expect Jason Mirayes to outperform Winsome Earle-Sears in every part of the state. He's an incumbent. He's running against a way weaker opponent, and the polls reflect that, often by 8 to 12 point margins. But I think most of the ticket splitting is going to have to come in these, kind of affluent, more politically moderate to liberal suburbs where Democrats have done well, but there are a lot of swing voters, right? And we saw in 2021, we saw a lot of Biden voters cross over for Youngkin in places like Loudoun County. So Spanberger might do well in Loudoun County. She might cook up like a 21-point win there, which would be, I think, solid for her. But we would need to see Jason Mirayes get close to the Youngkin number. And if anything, he could do better than Youngkin in Loudoun County just because Loudoun got a lot redder last year, right? I'm interested to see how well he does there. He shouldn't win it against Jay Jones, but it could be quite close. It could be like a 7 or 8 point margin, depending on what kind of election that we see. But regardless, there should be some ticket splitting in Northern Virginia, especially in these more affluent areas. There should be some ticket splitting in Richmond as well. There are a lot of white, suburban voters who maybe supported Youngkin or are a little more moderate, but trended blue presidentially past few cycles. It should be a bit less in these areas than in Nova, because Richmond was a lot bluer in 2024 than Nova was, but there still should be a detectable ticket split between Spanberger and between Jay Jones. So those are my two areas to watch for when we think a little bit about this race in terms of where the ticket split is going to come from. Because obviously, I would say that insofar as we're expecting Spanberger to win, we have to think, okay, there has to be a decent number of Spanberger voters who are going to vote for Jason Mirayes. And so now we have to go back to the polls, because the polls do tell that story, right? And if we look at these polls, we can see what we're getting. So Insider Advantage, which is a reasonably respectable poll, they had Spanberger up by 10. They have Jones up by 2. We had Qantas had Spanberger up by 9, Jones up by 1, so we get 8-point deltas there. Trafalgar had Spanberger up by 7 and Mirayes up by 10, so that's a 10-point delta. That's about what I'm expecting. Emerson, they're pretty good for Jones. They have him up by 3, and then we see that they have Spanberger up by 11. So, we're getting a couple 8-point deltas. Atlas Intel, this was the best poll in 2024. They're a bit more mixed in off-year elections, but they show Mirayes up by 2, and then they show Spanberger up by 9. So that's an 11-point delta. They have a pretty big delta relative to the 8-point delta that we're seeing in other polls. And then lastly, State Navigate, which is a local pollster, Jones up by 4, Spanberger, they have her up by 13. So that's a 9-point delta. So the delta is it's between 8 and 11 points in most of these final week pollsters. The reason I think it's going to be close to 11 than it will be to 8 is just because, generally speaking, polls in the final week, earlier on, they will not do this, but when you look at polls in the final week or two of the campaign, they'll often underestimate ticket splitting, just because the respondents in the final weeks are often a little more skewed towards the party that has momentum, right? Nationally, there might be Democrats, so you might be getting more partisan Democrats who are not going to split their ticket responding. It's it's happened a lot in 2024 where there was some response bias where Kamala Harris surged immediately after Biden dropped out of the race, where we saw Democrats get really energized. They were really happy about the election. They were responding to all the polls, and they were saying, I'm voting for Kamala, which is why she got a bit of a boost that might not have been fully real. But anyways, that's beside the point. I think Mirayes is going to win this race. It's going to be very close. And that's my prediction. It's a gutsy one. He's a Republican in a blue state. Harris +6. But I think Mirayes is going to pull it out by a point. Probably less than that. It's going to be pretty identical to what he did in 2021, where he won by 0.8 of a percentage point, right? And there's a couple things that I think really strike me, that strike me about this race that give the compelling argument to Mirayes over Jay Jones. The first is that Jay Jones has not been treated very nicely by Democrats in the past 3 weeks. They have given up. I don't know, given up, but they've pulled a lot of their resources. They're spending in other races. They're pulling a lot of their ads. They're not giving Jones as much help as they were going to give him, or as they were planning on giving him. And part of that might just be that they think the race is truly unwinnable at this point, which I don't, maybe that's part of it, right? Even though it's not unwinnable, it's a blue state. Jones can still win. I wouldn't be shocked if he wins tonight. But the other part of it is I think Democrats just see less of an obligation to defend him because he has this scandal, because they maybe don't want to be associated with him. And so what that means is that with Democrats less energized and invested in protecting him, there's just less of an argument he can make to voters. And what that means is, and I'm repeating myself, but what you're really getting at here is a race where the final word to swing voters, to moderate voters, is coming from Jason Mirayes. He's going to flood the airwaves. He's been doing this for the past 3 weeks. He's flooding the airwaves. He's getting out in larger numbers. And the word the voters are going to hear before they vote is going to be pro-Mirayes and anti-Jay Jones. And there's a lot for Mirayes to work with the Jay Jones scandal. And, thinking about the point in time we're in politically, not only are we in a bit of a more conservative era right now, I think just socially, but we're also in an era where just, kind of to talk about the elephant in the room, 2 months ago, Charlie Kirk was shot and killed, right? This is a very, I think, we're in uncharted waters uh, right now politically, in the sense that we are seeing spikes in political violence that we haven't seen in decades. And I think that's rightfully that's making voters uncomfortable. That might have a bit of an impact on this race because it's kind of in the back of mind for a lot of people, right? And I don't mean that in a political sense, in the sense that I'm endorsing someone or that I'm saying, I want you to think something or the other. I just think this is going to be a real impact that people are downplaying because you can't really show it in the polls. So that's the first thing that makes J. Jones scandal like I would say like maybe uniquely bad. The second thing is that, just for the time, the second thing is that I haven't really heard a J. Jones like official stance. I haven't really heard like a official response. And I think that's because of the first thing I said, which is that Democrats aren't really funding him to the extent that they were initially. Which, again, who's getting the final word? Mirayes, not J. Jones. The other thing I want to talk about here is nationally, or national problems. And I know Democrats have a bit of a national advantage right now because they're the party out of power. That's all well and good. That will work in their favor. But I don't think that it's as big as the one they had in 2017. And even in 2017, we saw the Republicans do well down ballot in Virginia. Now, that was 8 years ago. It was a different time. But in the legislature, Republicans, won a fair share of the vote. They got, I think, 47% of the vote in the House of Delegates. It was around that. They did quite well. Or I think actually might have been a little more than that. So what we see is that even though Democrats have a clear advantage nationally and they're out of power, that doesn't, in Virginia, that doesn't always translate to them, getting like automatic wins. Because in 2017, even though they won the race for governor, down ballot, there was some ticket splitting that really benefited Republicans. And by the way, where'd that ticket splitting come from? A lot of it came in the suburbs of Richmond and in Loudoun County and in Northern Virginia, which is, the two areas I identified are going to be crucial for Jason Mirayes. Lastly, and this is a little bit of a flyer, but my suspicion is that Democrats are not going to have as big of a turnout advantage as people think they are. Obviously, the electorate will be better for them than it was in 2021, where Republicans had a turnout advantage. But I think the electorate might be a little bit router than people anticipate. And that shouldn't hurt Spanberger too much, because I think she's going to do well with persuasion, and she's going to win a good number of swing voters who are just going to choose her over Winsome Earle-Sears. But that's going to hurt J. Jones a lot, because he's going to lose, obviously, moderate voters by a decisive margin, and he's going to lose a lot of swing voters who are going to maybe consider voting for him before the scandal. And so, obviously, turnout's going to be big for J. Jones, especially like if I think a big part of this is black turnout. Black turnout obviously is huge for Democrats. Black voters are pretty reliable for Democratic candidates, so J. Jones' high black turnout would definitely help him. But at this point, I don't think we're seeing signs of like a super blue electorate in Virginia. We're seeing signs of like a moderately Democratic electorate that will probably get Spanberger elected by a healthy margin. But is it going to be enough to save J. Jones? I'm betting on no. So those are my thoughts on that race. It's really close to me. I wouldn't be shocked if J. Jones won by like 4 points. I wouldn't be shocked if it's like just not that close and he wins by 4. Just because people don't want to split their ticket. But as we saw last year, ticket splitting's still a thing. Sherrod Brown outran Kamala Harris by 8 points. In Nebraska, Dan Osborne outran Kamala Harris by like 19 points. Larry Hogan outran Donald Trump by a similar amount. So for the right or wrong candidate, people will ticket split. And in an off-year election without Trump or Harris on the ballot, I think that actually dynamic might even be easier to see realized. So again, I think Spanberger wins by 10 and change, Hashmi by 9 and change. Give me Jason Mirayes to be reelected as Virginia's Attorney General by like 0.6. It's going to be very close. Probably not going to get a call till late. So get the popcorn ready for that. Last thing I want to say before we head out and I bookend these predictions and you come back to them tomorrow is that I think Democrats are going to win the House of Delegates decisively. It's going to be I think a 56 to 58 type of night for them. A lot of it's going to come down to how much Spanberger wins by. If she wins by 13, it could be a 60-seat type of night for Democrats. If she wins by 7, it could be a 54, 53 type of night for Democrats. I would be shocked if Republicans flip the House of Delegates. Democrats currently, do not hold any Trump seats, and the reddest seat the Democrats hold while they have this majority, they have 51 seats. The reddest seat that they hold is a Harris plus 5 district. So there's not a lot of places for Republicans to play offense. even on a great night, I think they're still going to lose a seat or two. But on like an average night, like a night that I'm expecting, they're probably going to lose anywhere from 5 to 8 seats. So Democrats will probably pick up some seats in the legislature, and that'll be helpful for Governor Spanberger with her agenda. So those are my predictions. Please let me know what you think, and I will see you all very soon. We'll be talking a lot about these races. Be sure to check out my video in New Jersey if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much.